a lot of stairways and walkways. It would be easy to get lost. The first few times that you walk around, it's a little confusing.
These halls were once part of America's Great Wall of Defense, first against the British, then the Germans, then the Japanese. As far back as the Civil War, soldiers manned Oregon's coastal forts so the rest of us could go about our daily lives in safety. Interpreter Gail Hemmons says most visitors to what is now Fort Stevens State Park never venture into these dark alleys to learn their history. This is the Fort Stevens Underground.
In World War II, they actually made offices down here on the bottom level. They put acoustical tile on the ceiling so they didn't have the echo. They paneled the walls and put wood floors in, and they did put a furnace in. So it was a little more livable then.
This is Gun Battery Mishler. It was constructed in 1898 and remained in active service through 1947. It stands obsolete and empty today.
I've never seen any spider webs in here. Probably not a lot to live on.
Stalagmites and stalactites give the battery a lonely cave-like feel. But at one time, hundreds of Army and Navy servicemen called this home. From these catacombs, the soldiers stood at the ready 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, serving the needs of massive guns on the surface called disappearing rifles. These weapons were pretty high-tech at the time. Their design made them all but invisible to enemies offshore in the ocean or in the Columbia River.
The only enemies that the soldiers really had were enemy ships that might be coming up the river and would be firing shells. So the purpose of these guns was to be down behind a very thick concrete wall, and then when they were ready to fire, they would go up over the wall, fire, and then disappear from view of enemy ships that might be up in the river.
Much of the work needed to keep the guns operational took place here, below ground.
The thickness of the wall here, which is maybe 2.5, 3 feet thick, is thick enough that it could withstand, hopefully, a direct hit that might come from an enemy ship or be dropped from a plane.
These two-story concrete armaments, and there are several at the fort, offered function but little comfort. Unlike the other batteries, during World War II, the gun pits of Battery Mishler were capped. The bomb preparation rooms converted to offices.
You kind of have to use your imagination because this is the gun pit where one of the guns was situated. When this was used as a gun battery during World War I, these pillars were not here and the ceiling did not cover the battery. You can see that there's not nearly as much room for the men to maneuver, and that's what these long tunnels were for. These are called ramming tunnels. The men would stand back in this area right here, and there would be a long ramrod they would pick up, and the back of the gun was turned around to where they were standing. They would ram the shell and then ram the powder in at that point. The concussion from these guns was very severe, and we have a lot of folks who they come back who were stationed here who talk about the noise and the vibration and how oftentimes it would give them bloody noses or it would make their ears bleed.
We'll take a trip up to the upper level of the battery.
At nearby Battery Pratt, non-working gun replicas stand in for the real thing. None of the original guns remains.
The hole is actually for a counterweight, which is what helps to move the gun up and down over the wall. Worked a lot like a teeter-totter. They would flip a switch and a big heavy lead weight would drop down into the well. That would force the gun up, the gun would fire, and then the recoil or kick of it would automatically bring it back down behind the wall.
It took a disciplined and coordinated effort between men both above and below to keep the guns working.
Okay, we're down in the lower level of the battery. There's the powder room and the shell room, and the powder was kept in silk bags and then placed in these metal canisters until it was time to use them.
They would be brought out.
If an enemy was spotted, powder would be loaded into shells and sent along a conveyor to elevator shafts. Here, it was raised mechanically to the workers loading their weapons in the gun pits above.
It took probably 25 men from just the point to getting the powder, the shells, everything upstairs, including the men that would actually aim the gun.
It's an overlooked point of history that as far back as the Civil War, Union forces feared that the British would join the battle on the side of the Southern Confederacy. Union soldiers stationed here kept an eye out for invading British forces steaming down the coast from Vancouver, BC, headed for the Columbia. That attack never came. Proudly, in fact, through the fort's long history, no guns at Fort Stevens were ever fired in anger, but there were close calls. Battery Russell is the battery closest to the beach and the one most familiar to park visitors. Today, there are few signs of the near tragedy that took place here.
Late one night, about 11:30 on June 21st, 1942, a Japanese submarine surfaced about 9 miles out in the ocean and started firing shells at the fort. If we were to fire back, the flash of these guns firing would have given away the exact position of the fort and the batteries. And so the commander that night decided not to fire back, just to kind of see what would happen.
The firing ended almost as quickly as it started, and the Americans never did fire back. Japanese submariners later claimed that they didn't know the fort existed, that their attack was only meant to scare local residents in Astoria and Hammond. The bombing did make local headlines, but as a national event, it was largely ignored. This overgrown crater south of the fort, now marked with a small monument, is one of the few reminders to visitors of what happened that day.
But this is the fort's claim to fame to be the only military installation on the continental United States to be fired on by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812.
Today, the concrete batteries weather frequent cold and rain, but as a military defense, they are obsolete. The advent of aircraft that could spot and pummel the fort from above made big fortified armaments a thing of the past.
These guns could fire twice a minute.
The fort was closed in 1965 and converted to a state park. Visitors now come to the park for its beach, its campground, or to see the rusting hulk of the Peter Iredale, a 1906 shipwreck caused by weather, not enemy fire. But the batteries remind us that the ocean was not always just a place of recreation and inspiration.
The threat was always out there, that someone might come and bomb our shorelines or try to get up the rivers, because most of the river harbors had very big cities right, not too far up, like Portland in this instance. Nowadays, you don't have to be strategically positioned, to fight an enemy. You can fire a gun from the middle of the country by pushing a button. And so this is kind of a thing of the past.